Welcome to the Flynn Brothers podcast. I'm John.
And I'm Jimmy. Today's big idea, the Blubber and Brilliance of Moby-Dick.
We run through the plot of Moby-Dick, recounting some of our favorite passages and analyzing some of the novel's craziest moments.
Later, we debate the book's status as the great American novel with a little help from our friend Bob Dylan.
Finally, we pitch our ideas for a modern-day movie adaptation of Herman Melville's masterpiece.
It's all coming up. But first, here's the Solons.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Welcome into the Flynn Brothers Book Club. This is our sort of running episode format that we will do. It's, I guess, a two-person book club. It's just...
No. Other people, they can have a seat on the couch. We've got some cheese and crackers laid out.
Yeah.
Help yourself to any refreshment.
But we're going to go through certain books and talk about them. And today's book is Herman Melville's Moby-Dick. Now, Moby-Dick, famously a very long book. I think it's 133 chapters, something like that, hundreds and hundreds of pages. And you read it pretty voraciously, pretty quickly. Is that right?
Yeah, I read it when I was up at a camp that I volunteer at where you sleep on bunk beds, and it can be occasionally a bit noisy and stifling in there. So I was just crushing pages on the high seas as I was tossing and turning in bed. So
How long did it take you think?
I killed most of it during that week, and then I finished it up, so about 2 weeks.
I, on the other hand, took about 6 months to read it. The book itself was sort of my white whale, and I finally slayed it. But it took a while. It reminded me of when we were kids, and we'd have dinner, and you would always eat your vegetables first, and I would always eat them last. That sort of procrastinator mentality, manifests itself years later. But it's a very interesting book. We're going to get into the plot and some quotes and talk about it. But just a little overview. One thing we were struck by, having both read this, is Herman Melville's style. And, this book came out, I believe, like mid-1800s, right? And not a lot of books around at that time. And what historians say, and I think Melville himself said, that a lot of his style was influenced by the Bible and Shakespeare. And the book certainly reads that way.
Yeah, I think also another thing to keep in mind is people bought books to read potentially over 6 months. You wanted a book to be long. If you invested in this piece of entertainment, you wanted it to entertain you for a very long time.
Yeah. And it's considered one of the great American novels, which we will get to later. But during Herman Melville's life, this book was not particularly acclaimed. It didn't really get a lot of acclaim until many decades after his death.
Melville was thought of as something of a loser, a failure.
Yeah. A loser writer, something we could never relate to. But it's genre-wise, it's sort of, Moby-Dick, it's sort of this adventure swashbuckler mixed with Herman Melville's kind of a few rambling chapters, sort of combining semi-accurate facts and observations about whales.
It's very much like a podcast.
It is.
He's kind of podcasting.
Yeah.
He's just letting it rip, getting loose, letting his ideas fly.
Moby-Dick, the first podcast. Yeah. So we'll get into all this in our recap later on. But let's go through the story and discuss some of our favorite parts. And Moby-Dick begins very famously with the opening line, "Call me Ishmael." It is an iconic line in literature, immediately establishes the first-person voice, the fact that our narrator is going to be this character Ishmael, who's sort of a low-level seaman, sailor on a whaling vessel. And what do you think, just out of context, "Call me Ishmael"? Does it deserve this sort of acclaim that it is this great opening line in literature?
In addition to being phonetically pleasing, there is something interesting about somebody saying, call me John.
Right.
You know, like,
Right,
is that your name? Is this some sort of alter ego you're adapting?
It also immediately establishes its influences as being the Bible, because he's going by a name only heard of in the Bible. But I think it's a very good opening line on its own for the reason you mentioned. But I think in the context of the opening paragraph, it's very, very fascinating. If you'll indulge me, I'll go ahead and read the opening paragraph. How's that sound?
I will indulge you.
Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular of interest to me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. Essentially, Ishmael is saying, if I don't go to sea, I'm going to put one in my head. It's this very grim sort of like, he's so passionate. It's kind of about sailing. It's his only escape, right?
Yeah. And I think in addition to that, you're struck by how modern this sensibility is, and it's actually is, despite how long the sentences are, and some of the outdated health ideas, driving off the spleen, regulating the circulation, it does feel kind of inviting. Like it's when I remember when I first picked it up, I was like, oh, this is more interesting than I thought Moby-Dick would be.
What would you say in your life is your passion or your activity that keeps the gun, the pistol, and ball away from you? What is the thing you need to do with some regularity that keeps you from ending this cruel facade? Podcasting. Mine was eating mac and cheese. It's something I do, I would say, every 2 weeks, or I started getting a little shaky. But Ishmael, in the beginning of the book, he's kind of hopping around Nantucket and, those sort of docks and stuff. You can hear the ding, 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 ding.
Clop,
you can,
clop.
the hooves. You can really get a sense of the world.
Melville.
Fabulous. Melville's building. And he stops in at this inn, and the inn's all full up, so he's got a bunk with someone, and he bunks with a native cannibal known by Queequeg. You think I'm saying that right? Queequeg?
Yeah, I think that's Queequeg. I think
Queequeg. Yeah, maybe Queequeg. We'll go with Queequeg. But Ishmael stays here, and he's telling the innkeeper, I'm not too hype on sharing a bed with another fella, especially one who may or may not be a cannibal. And there's this very suspense-filled scene Melville paints early in the book where Ishmael's in bed and he's nervous because he can see the shadow of Queequeg coming into the room, and Queequeg, from his point of view, doesn't know Ishmael's there, and Queequeg, he's holding severed heads that he's been trying to sell around town, as you do, and he actually holds a tomahawk over Ishmael, about to kill him, but then the innkeeper comes and stops Queequeg, and it's sort of this, it's almost a meet cute, right? Like you'd have in a romantic comedy.
Absolutely. It shows also the humble origins of Nantucket. These aren't the bed and breakfasts that we know today. You have to share a bed with a fellow man, and, complete stranger.
And they sleep together and they become fast friends. And here's a fun quote from the next morning. Melville writes, upon waking next morning about daylight, I found Queequeg's arm thrown over me in the most loving and affectionate manner. You had almost thought I had been his wife. Kind of a nice sentiment for where they started him finding him to be a cannibal to, this is my soulmate.
You kind of see him waking up with a contented sigh.
Yeah.
He's very open-minded. He's not judgmental, of the culture. It's something that you wouldn't expect to see during this time, in addition to the, comfort with masculinity, if you will.
And, you would perceive Ishmael, this white character, to be, and he is at first very suspicious of this native character. But this scene, and then later in the book, there's so much Melville writes about racial harmony and just sort of America's multicultural fabric, which I find very interesting. Yeah. And I think, too, obviously, you could read in some homosexual, homoerotic themes into this scene as well, right?
Do you think? I guess so. Now that I really look at it, maybe they're just two real good buddies.
Maybe they're a couple of good pals.
Fast pals.
Yeah, fast pals. Hopping into bed together. So both these fellas, they're hired on this whaling ship known as the Pequod. And Pequod was named after the Pequot, which were a Native American tribe. And I think what Melville tries to communicate with the name of the ship is, these shipmates end up being sort of a tribe, right? I mentioned the multicultural fabric. And something I found very funny is Queequeg is hired in the very cool... hired to be a harpooner, which is a very cool, sexy, violent, masculine job on the whaling vessel, whereas Ishmael is hired as a green hand, which is essentially a low-ranking crew member.
Yeah, just you're swabbing the poop deck, probably.
Yes. And it's interesting, I think, to have the narrator be someone whose eyes are wide open, who has that naivete, who has that sense of discovery.
And it is interesting, too, about this whaling culture that the only thing that matters is your competency.
Yes.
None of the other considerations of, race, where you're from, gender, or, well, they're all men. But at the same time, it is just like, look, can you harpoon a huge whale? Welcome aboard.
And, of course, the captain of the Pequod, indulge our audience. Who is the famous captain of the Pequod?
Captain Ahab.
That's great. Look at that. We've got a clip from the audiobook. The rights cleared. And Ahab, of course, known for his peg leg, which replaced the leg that was taken from his nemesis, Moby-Dick. And you jotted down here a couple of quotes the book had in the descriptions of Ahab. You want to help us out here?
Yes. He's a grand, ungodly, godlike man, Captain Ahab. Doesn't speak much, but when he does speak, then you may well listen. ... His whole high, broad form seemed made of solid bronze... ... threading its way out from among his gray hairs and continuing right down one side of his tawny, scorched face and neck till it disappeared in his clothing. You saw a slender, rod-like mark, lividly whitish.
So this is, at the end, they're sort of describing a huge scar. Is that right?
That's right. It just jumps out off his tan skin. It's this milky white scar that you don't know how he got it, which I think is more interesting than, this was the story of it. It's just I'm sure they're staying up late, drinking their grog, wondering how he got it.
But I think part of it, too, later in the book, they talk about Ahab. He's got a family back home, but he never sees them. He's married to the sea, and he's been on all these whaling voyages. And, his leg was taken by Moby-Dick. And I think one can surmise it's possible that scar was from this dangerous line of work he's in.
That, and he's also just kind of a marked man.
Yes.
This is an important figure. This guy's a little off,
Yes.
He ain't like the rest of us.
And, of course, Ahab's nemesis, the object of his obsession, is the titular character, Moby-Dick. And Moby-Dick, you would imagine him to be this very, he is a very grand antagonist, but he's kind of weird looking based on the descriptions in the book, right?
He's misshapen because of all of the different battles that all these different people who've tried to spear him and bring him down and harvest his blubber. He's white, which is uncommon for a sperm whale. Huge, biggest whale they ever saw. Crooked jaw, like he took a haymaker. They ascribe to him this malicious intelligence, which I think is an interesting phrase. Huge, pearly teeth. Sperm whales, unlike most whales, have teeth. Scars. There's a harpoon still stuck in him. I mean, he's just this...
He's this unbeatable foe. And frankly, visually, he kind of mirrors Ahab, right? He's battle-scarred and ugly, but there's this captivating nature about him.
Nailed it. The
rest of the crew, we have Starbuck, who is the first mate, Stubb, who is the second mate, and Flask, who are the third mate. Not super well-defined characters in the book. They're all white men. Some of the few white men, in addition to Ahab and Ishmael, on the boat. Most of the rest of the crew of the Pequod is multicultural. The harpooners, there's Queequeg, Tashtigo. You think I'm saying that right? Tashtigo.
Right,
he's a Native American. And then Dagu, who's West African. I think the diversity in this book. It's not like it's Disney Marvel shoehorned, right? It's based on Melville was on these whaling ships, and he realized and recognized and experienced that they were very multicultural. And I think, when you talk about its status as the great American novel, America is multicultural. There's people from all over, right? So I think that's a very unique thing about this book and about our country.
And in addition to that, when you're out at sea, I think you really need a civilization for like racism to make sense, like all of this other stuff. When you're out at sea and it's just you and like 80 other guys, how could you let those lines, they would be meaningless and as foolish as they are in reality.
You're just trying to survive.
Yeah.
And it's like, why would we let anything get in the way of that?
Yeah.
All right. Well, then the crew of the Pequod set sail, and we are going to sail into a break. We'll be right back. And we're back. Well, we promised the blubber and brilliance of Moby-Dick. We've discussed a little bit of the brilliance. Now I think we need to address the blubber. And we're talking figuratively. We will talk literally about blubber later. But figuratively, there's a lot of blubber in Moby-Dick because there's a lot of downtime on a whaling ship. And Melville has so many chapters in this book that really don't move the action forward. They're not concerned with moving the plot forward. They're concerned with just sharing his musings and thoughts as someone who's been on a lot of whaling ships.
Yeah, this is the podcast section, and I think what it does is it gives you, the reader, the feeling of being out on this ship with him, that there is lots of periods of downtime where you're doing nothing but, floating on water, going wherever the wind blows you, and the wind blows Ishmael in a lot of different directions in regards to his thoughts on the sea and whales.
And he's got all these pseudo-scientific thoughts and theories and observations, and one of the funniest ones is how he classifies a whale. Now, granted, this book was almost 200 years ago it came out, right? So we've learned a lot of things as society, as people of science since then. And you and I know, sitting here in 2025, that whales are in fact mammals. And what are the two criteria that whales meet that make them mammals?
Oh, they give live birth and they lactate. If I may, a brief history of the whale. I hate to do this to interrupt you.
Wait a minute. All right, go quick. Better be brief.
Some of our listeners may know, some may not know. Whales crawled out of the ocean, evolved into sort of grass-eating creatures on land, and then slowly made their way back into the ocean. That's why they don't have gills, but the blowhole instead.
Wow. That was sort of like how horses were in North America, left North America, came back to North America.
The whales were like, whoa, water.
Yeah,
I love this.
Sort of like how we were on topic, then we got off topic. Okay, never mind.
Back to topic.
All right. So anyway, we know whales now are mammals, but back then, here's a quote from Melville's Ishmael. He says, quote, "Be it known that, waiving all argument, I take the good old-fashioned ground that the whale is a fish and call upon holy Jonah to back me." So not only does he misclassify the whale, he calls to a story from the Bible to sort of back him up.
Which, all of its merits set aside, is not known exactly for its scientific accuracy.
Correct. So anyway, just a hilarious line in the book.
I do like that he's the good old-fashioned ground.
Yeah. He almost convinced me for a minute. But another fascinating thing, you talked about this a lot in our private conversations, which we now are going to make public, but you were really fascinated by how sperm whales feed.
Yes.
And you jotted down kind of this quote about how they feed, because again, we didn't have underwater cameras. We didn't have all this scientific technology we have. A lot of this is just Melville's observations that he imposes onto Ishmael. But you jotted down a nice paragraph here about sperm whale feeding.
Yes. Here we go. "For though other species of whales find their food above water and may be seen by man in the act of feeding, the spermaceti whale obtains his whole food in unknown zones below the surface, and only by inference is it that anyone can tell of what precisely that food consists. At times, when closely pursued, he will disgorge what are supposed to be the detached arms of the squid, some of them thus exhibited exceedingly 20 and 30 feet in length. The sperm whale, unlike other species, is supplied with teeth in order to attack and tear it." This is fascinating to me because the giant squid at this time is essentially a sea monster.
Yeah.
And they live at the depths of the ocean. We still haven't really even seen one live. We've captured them dead. We've seen some footage of some smaller ones, but never like the real big dog. And it's incredible. Essentially, what a sperm whale does is eats sea monsters.
Yeah, no, it's pretty incredible. And I think, too, you get a sense, if you haven't read Moby-Dick and you're listening to this podcast as a little Cliff's note, Melville's prose is a bit difficult. I mean, you and I are just struggling to read it out loud, but it is very beautiful and it is very descriptive. And, he leaves nothing unsaid. Apologize for the double negative, but it's like everything he has to say about whales in this story is said in the book, and he is incredibly detailed, and it is so of the time, the writing, but it is so beautiful and so epic.
You have to rewire your brain in terms of the influence of Shakespeare. What's similar to that is the sentence construction is just different from the way we organize sentences. He loves setting up a sentence with 20 words, and then you get the subject and the verb, which is the exact opposite of the way that we write today. And
right. He's just got tons of dependent clauses and, tons of insertions. And, your obsession with whales, though, it goes beyond the feeding, beyond their evolution. You also loved in the book when Melville talks about how whales breathe. Do you want to just sort of summarize for us how whales breathe?
Yeah. I mean, whales, they have a blowhole in the top of their head. They breathe in air through that, suck it into their lungs, where they have all of these different veins and capillaries that hold the oxygen, which allow them to dive for up to an hour, the sperm whale, and that's how Melville categorizes it. And he compares it to a camel drinking a bunch of water before going into the desert. And then the other thing that's interesting about the need for the sperm whale to rise to the surface, this great beast that feasts upon sea monsters, is that is the only thing that makes it vulnerable. Every other fish, that breathes oxygen through gills that it acquires from the water, they don't have to come to the surface, but the whale does, and this is what makes it vulnerable to attack.
In these days, men jabbing harpoons and spears into them.
Tashtego and Dagu
and Queequeg, that's right. But you mentioned we mentioned the blubber, the downtime in the book, and I think you alluded to this earlier. Going to sea in those days, it was like going to space. So much of the book is, we gotta just do maintenance, hoist the mainsail, swab the poop deck. If you were to watch a sci-fi movie where they go to space, so much of it is just beep boop 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 on the control panels and then the computer.
We have to go outside to tighten panel 3.
Exactly, and so much of the ocean, especially this time and even now, there's just so much that is unexplored. So much is unknown. And I think that is part of why we go to a book like this, is that sense of adventure, that sense of mystery. And, this line of work they're in, it's very risky. It's very dangerous. You can lose your leg and have a peg put there instead, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're going out into a completely inhospitable environment. If you're off the ship, you're dead within a matter of hours.
But in addition to the blubberous musings of Herman Melville / Ishmael, there is some good old-fashioned plot, some good old-fashioned adventure, and most of it is the whaling ship, the Pequod, going around hunting and butchering whales that aren't Moby-Dick, right? All these guys who are on the whaling ship think, we're on a whaling ship, we're going to make some money, and Ahab, not so secretly, is like, we're looking for Moby-Dick. And nowadays, obviously, whaling is mostly outlawed. It's so brutal, and they were overfished. Here we go, keep referring to the whale as a fish. Maybe he was right. But it's a very brutal process how they hunt these whales. Essentially, you have the big ship, the Pequod, and they lower, when a whale is spotted, they lower these smaller boats with crew members stocked with harpoons and spears, and these smaller boats go toward the whale and are basically just trying to harpoon and stab it to death. And then once the whale is killed, if they're able to kill it, they're not always successful. In fact, I think it's a pretty low percentage of the time they're successful. They essentially drag the whale back to the original ship and put it along the side of it where they, begin to harvest its riches, which we will discuss in a minute. But, and you got to work quick, right? Because as soon as the whale's there dead, bleeding out into the water, who comes along? The sharks. Da-dum, right? Like
It's a dinner bell.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
blood.
The sharks just start gnashing and gnashing. And so you as crew members on these whaling ships, if you want to make money, you got to harvest the riches. And I want to discuss the riches. There's 3 riches that come from the whale. The first is blubber, which, is in our title. And we're going to talk about the literal blubber now after discussing the figurative. But I wrote down this quote about how the crew members harvest the blubber and how it is biologically situated on a whale. So here we go. Now, as the blubber envelopes the whale precisely as the rind does an orange, so is it stripped off from the body precisely as an orange is sometimes stripped by spiralizing it. For the strain constantly kept up by the windlass continually keeps the whale rolling over and over in the water, and as the blubber in one strip uniformly peels off along the line called the scarf, simultaneously cut by the spades of Starbuck and Stubb, the mates, and just as fast as it is thus peeled off, and indeed by that very act itself, it is all the time being hoisted higher and higher aloft, till its upper end grazes the main top. The men at the windlass then cease heaving, and for a moment or two the prodigious, blood-dripping mass sways to and fro as if let down from the sky, and everyone present must take good heed to dodge it when it swings, else it may box his ears and pitch him headlong overboard. Can you briefly translate what I just read?
They peel whales like you peel an orange until it goes all the way up to the top part of a ship, which just gives you an idea of how much blubber and skin. It's at the top of a ship, and then it's just swinging around, dripping blood, and you got to get out of its way.
Or it'll smack you in the face. Yeah, it's incredible. And then, they cut the blubber off, and then they melt it into liquid, and that is how you get the oil for lamps, and they would, use the blubber to make soaps, paints, varnish back in those days.
I mean, this is the main way people lit things other than candles.
They didn't have electricity, right?
It's why whaling is such a massive industry.
Yeah,
why it's so
at the time.
Yeah,
not anymore.
No
so
longer.
Much. Yeah,
we
yeah.
figured out some other methods.
Alternatives. Thanks, Edison. But he mentions in the book a large sperm whale can yield about 100 barrels of oil. So you figure, well, you catch a couple of whale, you're rolling in the money.
You're
right?
doing good.
So the slightly more valuable version of blubber is the second rich you can harvest from the whale. It's called spermaceti. And you want to tell us a little bit about spermaceti?
Yeah, so it's sort of like the oil that gets melted down from the blubber, but it's actually contained in the top half of the whale's massive head. So if you picture a sperm whale sort of at the front part of the hammer there, and it's a finer oil. It smells less. It's used, and it's just better texture all around, higher quality. It's ointments, and at this time, some of the wealthiest whalers, if you were really rolling in it, you would burn spermaceti for your candles. And basically what you do is you just bust a hole in the head of the whale and you guide a bucket down into it until it entirely disappears, and then you pull it back up, kind of like a well, I guess would be the way that you would think of it, but you're pulling up this
or oil, like an oil,
like
oil or
well.
water well.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Take your pick. And he describes it, Melville, when they're pulling up the bucket, it's all bubbling like a dairy maid's pail of new milk.
Oh, man, I guess just so rich. Or
I think it is milky, and
yeah,
it's just it's gross, and yet at the same time, there's this intriguing element about it. You're just like, gotta get some of that spermaceti. And this is obviously where the whale gets its name, the sperm whale.
The things people do for money, huh? The third rich they can harvest from the whale is, help me with the pronunciation, ambergris. Ambergris. And that is a waxy, soft, fragrant substance that coats the bones and beaks of giant squids, which the sperm whales eat in the deep, and it's used for perfumes, has this sort of unique, spicy fragrance. I think it's still somewhat used today, not super common, but
it is.
Somewhat.
Yeah,
right?
it's not, everywhere, but it definitely is still used. There's a pretty famous Bob's Burgers episode where they find a hunk of it.
That's right. So it'll wash up on shore. People aren't necessarily hunting whales and digging into their...
You no longer are allowed to harvest it out of a... They describe a scene in the book where Stubb digging into the side of a rotting rotting whale past the side of him, quote, as if he were digging a cellar in the sea. And he then compares this whale's flesh to English loam, which is, good, rich soil.
Oh, okay.
And everyone's crowding around him like he's a prospector. He cries out, I have it, a purse, a purse. And dropping his spade, he thrust both hands in and drew out handfuls of something that looked like ripe Windsor soap or rich mottled old cheese, very unctuous and savory withal. You might easily dent it with your thumb. It is of a hue between yellow and ash color, and this, good friends, is ambergris, worth a gold guinea an ounce to any druggist. Some 6 handfuls were obtained.
So yeah, you could just do the math with the blubber, with the spermaceti, with the ambergris. If you were on a whaling ship that caught a few whales and you made it back, you could be okay for a little while.
It's like going gold mining, but the mines are in water and they're attacking you and they're huge whales.
Yeah. Nothing to add. That's fabulously put. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Well, as we mentioned, this Ahab fella, he's obsessed with finding Moby-Dick, and the Pequod travels quite literally the entire world looking for Moby-Dick. I Googled online an image of the path that the ship takes, over the map of the world, and obviously we're in an audio medium, so we, you can't quite post the photo, so to speak. So I'll go ahead and describe it if that's okay with you.
Please.
But essentially, the ship starts in Nantucket, up in the northeastern part of the United States. They travel southbound down the Atlantic Ocean to South America. Then they go east toward Africa, across to the Cape of Good Hope, which, is at the southern tip. And then they round that. They go up through the Indian Ocean, where they then go into the Pacific Ocean, where they eventually find Moby-Dick. They quite literally circumnavigate the globe.
Darn near, and hit pretty much every ocean except the Arctic.
Yeah, and it really, it's a perfect encapsulation of Ahab's obsession with Moby-Dick.
In some ways, isn't it all just one ocean?
Yeah, it's
Where do they split it up?
Quite thought-provoking.
Where does the Indian Ocean start?
Hey, where does the Pacific end? But along the way, the Pequod pass all these ships, as they're hunting and slaughtering and Ishmael's, getting things scientifically wrong. They pass all these ships who really want nothing to do with Moby-Dick. Every time they pass a ship, there's some kind of ritual where Ahab boards the other ship and members of their ship board the Pequod. And all these captains are basically like, either I haven't seen Moby-Dick, I've heard of him, and I want nothing to do with him, or they say he just slaughtered us, which is the case of the ship, the Rachel, which is one of the last ships they encounter, if not the last ship they encounter before they meet Moby-Dick. And their captain lost a son in one of the smaller ships, and they are basically now, the Rachel, on a rescue mission to try and find these lost sailors. And Ahab refuses flat out to help this guy look for the lost sailors because he's so one-track minded in finding Moby-Dick.
He's like, I'm gonna go after the thing that did this to you.
Yeah.
Have you seen the white whale? It's basically every time it's like, what? This guy's nuts. He's going after the thing that's killing all of us.
And the Pequod eventually does find Moby-Dick. How is Ahab able to locate Moby-Dick finally?
Ahab is at the edge of the boat, sniffing the air like a dog. He can smell the whale.
Which,
somehow.
to be fair, Moby-Dick would probably stink to high heaven, wouldn't he? Yeah, all those rotting
the blubber,
squids and that he ate.
The saltwater curing of the wounds, nonetheless. It's probably not very good.
And what is Ahab?
Terrible breath.
Oh yes. Well, yeah,
our teeth episode.
Hey, Moby-Dick breath that's got to be top 3. But what does Ahab say as he's sniffing the air?
So he sniffs the air, and then he has the men tie him to ropes and start pulling him upwards like you would a sail so he can get a better view. And then he points out and suddenly he exclaims, "There she blows! There she blows! A hump like a snow hill! It is Moby-Dick!"
And for how slow-paced the book is at a lot of the time, the climax is unbelievable.
Yes.
And this book essentially the end is the climax, and then
Yes.
it just sort of peters out into the resolution, which we'll get to.
They make you wait for it, though. You
Yes.
got to read a lot of book before
Yes.
Ahab spots Moby.
I read it on the Kindle, and I believe, they don't get on the ship. They have like the percent progress on the Kindle,
Yeah.
and they get on the ship around, I think, 20%. And then I think it's around 93, 94% of the way through the book. They finally beat Moby-Dick. And the climax is this 3-chapter, 3-day battle that they have against Moby-Dick. And essentially what happens is they get into the small boats, they stab him. Moby-Dick vanishes under the surface, then he bursts forth and destroys some of their smaller ships. And then they regroup, and, the next day they go after him, and boom, Moby-Dick strikes again. And it's just incredibly suspenseful. And of course, the whole time, Ahab is just stark raving mad, yelling things like you just quoted.
Plotting and scheming, extolling the men, trying to whip up their passions to go after this whale that's just darting underneath them so fast and bursting upwards with incredible power.
And Ahab, he's completely consumed at this point by his hatred for the whale. And you want to go ahead and read us the quote you got down here?
Yes, when he's about to spear the whale. This is finally Moby-Dick is near them. He's on the edge of this small boat, harpoon raised, and he says, "Towards thee I roll, thou all-destroying but unconquering whale. To the last I grapple with thee. From hell's heart I stab at thee. For hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee. Sink all coffins and all hearses to one common pool. And since neither can be mine, let me then tow to pieces while still chasing thee. Though tied to thee, thou damned whale, thus I give up the spear." And he throws the spear, and it's perfect.
Yes, and I believe Ahab christens is either that spear or later the harpoon with his own blood. Is that correct?
Yes.
And Ahab finally meets his tragic demise with the whale in this quote that I will read. "The harpoon was darted. The stricken whale flew forward with igniting velocity. The line ran through the grooves, ran foul. Ahab stooped to clear it. He did clear it, but the flying turn caught him round the neck, and voicelessly, as Turkish mutes bowstring their victim, he was shot out of the boat, ere the crew knew he was gone. Next instant, the heavy eye splice and the rope's final end flew out of the stark empty tub, knocked down an oarsman, and smiting the sea, disappeared in its depths."
Incredible.
Moby drags Ahab to hell, essentially a watery grave, let's say, and it's a completely befitting end to Ahab's life of obsession.
It's what he wants. It's what
Yes,
he says in the
yes.
thing. It's like, take me with you. I won't. There's no hearse. There's no coffin for old Ahab. It's me, attached to this whale, getting dragged around to pieces.
He dies what he loves doing. It's Adam Sandler winning the big bet at the end of Uncut Gems and getting a bullet in the head. You go out on top. And after Ahab's gone, the crew's kind of in shambles, and Moby-Dick destroys the ship, which sinks. And we get to the last line of the book. There is an epilogue after, but the last line of the book is thus. "Now, small fowls flew screaming over the yet yawning gulf. A sullen white surf beat against its steep sides. Then all collapsed, and the great shroud of the sea rolled on as it rolled 5,000 years ago." Whew, I got chills.
I got chills too.
Brilliantly poetic ending. Any great book, we read the first line, we read the last line. Any masterpiece, any book you're going to want to consider a great American novel, it will have a killer first line and it will have a killer last line. Sure, there'll be 133 chapters and 700 godforsaken pages in the middle, but he really knows how to start it and he really knows how to end it. The middle, you can say what you will, but the beginning and end of this book are so incredible, and the end image is so brilliant.
It starts incredibly personal to Ishmael. You're in his psyche, and the end of it is all of this is so small. All human activity, even this great grand adventure, disappears underneath the monstrously large ocean.
You think Melville mentions 5,000 years ago because that was how long and how old he figured the Earth was? Yeah. It's as old as time, 5,000 years. And then really quickly, the epilogue that comes after this, we learn Ishmael is the only survivor of the Pequod. Everyone else is killed and the boat sinks, and he's floating on a coffin. And who is he picked up by but the Rachel, the book, or excuse me, the boat from earlier that was looking for lost sailors at sea. And just a brilliant poetic ending. The epilogue's great. And yeah, man, the book lost me a little in the middle, but unlike Ahab, I survived Moby-Dick, and I'm sure glad I did, because it really is a wonderful novel.
It's a real feat to finish it. I think that it's intimidating in its length, but I think that by taking it on and saying, you know what, I am going to read this book. There is a reason it has survived all of these years, and people regard it in this way, and I want to know why that is. And I really just recommend it to anybody who's got some time on their hands and wants to really dive deep into a world that is, in many respects, so different from our own, but a narrator who voices things about life that ring true today, which are, it's really remarkable. I mean, it's one of the most wonderful things about books is that you can get inside the mind of a crazed man from 250 years ago and be like, man, you said it.
And now you know the story of Moby-Dick if you didn't before, and you can go show off at a dinner party. We'll be right back. Well, the verdict from the Flynn brothers is that Moby-Dick is brilliant, but a little blubbery. It is a very adventurous, fun, swashbuckling book, but it's a little monotonous.
I wouldn't want it really to be any other way. I think it's the way that it has to be to really capture what it's like being on those whaling vessels.
Yeah, I feel like if I were ever to reread it, I would skim the more pseudo-scientific, theorizing bits and get more to the plot. But yeah, some of them are pretty interesting. It is just, it sounds like you or me and the crazy things we think. And, everyone has crazy thoughts and observations. So in that way, it's kind of relatable.
It's fascinating, too, because it's like if you're going to write a book this big, obviously you're very literate and intelligent, but he just doesn't have all of the scientific data.
Right.
So he's just kind of trying to puzzle it out with his brain.
And that's all any of us are ever doing. We're just shooting from the hip, going with our gut, right, with as little science as possible. I want to talk a bit about some of the themes of the book. I'll kind of shoot out some 1 or 2 word little themes, and you hop in if you so desire. I think one of the biggest themes of the book is obsession. I think Ahab encapsulates that obsession. I guess Ishmael himself is a little obsessed with the world of whaling and sailing. Do you think obsession is sort of the main theme you would take away from this book?
Yeah, I mean, considering that calling something your white whale as
means obsession. Yeah, that's great. I think, in going with all the downtime in the book and the figurative blubber we discussed, I kind of think boredom is just one of the themes and stuff you do when you're bored.
That, and also just kind of searching for a meaningful occupation, and just like this job that he has is like a lot of the bad jobs that anybody's worked. I mean, his is more intense in a way, but like he's bored a lot at his job.
And it's, he's bored and vaguely suicidal. That's basically why he makes this decision that changes the course of his life, right? I think fate and prophecy are obviously big themes, given that this book is so inspired by the Bible. There's so many characters who are references to the Bible. There's many characters who give sort of prophetic statements. I think there's some preacher named Elijah at the beginning of the book before they go sailing. Queequeg and Ishmael here, this guy basically prophesies that it ain't gonna be a pleasure cruise. and so I think fate, prophecy, that sort of stuff, wouldn't you say that kind of counts as a theme as well?
Yeah, and wanting to give yourself over to something larger than you are. And I think a lot of the book just basically Ahab calls his own death right before he dies too, which is just
Babe Ruth calling the shot, right?
And it's not about really like surprise. I would say this book is not like, ooh, there's a twist around every corner. It's more about the execution. Like if you were to tell somebody when they first start out, what do you think's going to happen to Ahab? It's like, I think I think Moby-Dick's probably going to kill him.
Would it surprise you if he got dragged to a watery grave in the depths of hell? Yeah, no, it wouldn't. Another theme, the dominion of mankind. I think, with whaling at this time especially, it was mankind exerting its cruel hand over nature. And I think you could even find the reverse, sort of the lack of dominion of mankind when compared to the mighty whale.
Of course, especially at sea. However, you gotta give it up for humanity, despite the brutality and the gruesome spectacle that is whaling. It's incredible that these tiny apes
Yes.
are capable of bringing down whales.
It is incredible that once humanity is like, we're going to do this thing this way, we kind of always achieve it, for better or worse, right?
Other than worldwide peace, I guess.
Yeah, we're coming up short.
We're working on that one.
And then the last theme, which we touched on in the beginning, the American multicultural fabric. I think it's just, especially for a book at this time, the different cultures exhibited on the boat are very fascinating.
Yeah, really refreshing and just kind of cool to see, I think, too, because I think we have a tendency when we think about the past that we think everybody was backwards in the worst possible
Yes.
way. And
Yeah.
it's like, actually, there were some modern thinking people back at the
Yeah.
time. They may not have been the majority, but it's like, not everybody was terrible.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great way of expressing it. So we come to this question, is Moby-Dick the great American novel? But before we try to answer that, I think it's important to establish the criteria for what is a great American novel. I think there's a few things novels must have. They need to be from an American author. They need American characters in a setting, American setting. They need to be timeless, yet capture a distinct era in American history. So, this is a good example of a distinct chapter in American history. However, we can discuss later how timeless it is. And then I think the themes and messaging have to be unique to America and American identity. So, for example, the theme of obsession and, pursuing riches, right? That is very American, very uniquely American. I mean, you made the comparison to gold miners, and it's very, very true. So I think on the pro side for this being the great American novel, we mentioned it's brilliant. It's brilliantly written. I mean, the prose is just some of the best writing you'll ever read.
Yeah, and it really gets in your head, too. Like, if you're really reading Moby-Dick for an extended period of time, like when I read it over the 2 weeks, I was thinking like Melville, which was a crazy thing.
Better than thinking like Ahab, I guess. It's a very epic book. Anything where you're going on an adventure, you're going to see, especially in this time, like you mentioned, people, they didn't have TV. They didn't have iPads. This was their TV and iPad, and they would luxuriate in this book and enjoy reading it and rereading it and going on this adventure, pretending they were Ishmael.
This wasn't the binge culture, this fast food culture, this now, 15-second TikTok attention span
podcast every week. Yeah, no. They had self-respect back then. I think, too, the diverse characters, that makes it very uniquely American as well, as opposed to other installments, other books considered great American novels that are maybe just from one culture. This one paints kind of a broad swath, right?
It's the only place where all of these characters could come together.
Yes.
Like the only place in human history where all of these different people would, from all these far-flung corners of the earth, come together. And also it's this sort of beautiful vision because even though they're captained by this madman, they're all like harmonious for the most part. It's a pretty beautiful vision of what people can accomplish when they work together, even if they're from a bunch of different backgrounds and belief systems. And once they have one common goal, it's inspiring.
And now the cons. We discussed the pros, here are the cons. I think Moby-Dick's outdated in several respects. The whaling era does capture distinct era in American history, but it's a little outdated. I mean, is there even much to relate to anymore for modern audiences?
Not from a whaling perspective, and that way it's more of a historically interesting thing. It's like, oh wow, I can't believe that's how people actually used to live.
And then the factual inaccuracies, Melville standing on the firm ground that whales are fish, not mammals. There's several instances of that throughout the book. And then, really the biggest sin, though, I think, in terms of considering a great American novel, there's just too many plot digressions. There's too much away from the novel. There's too much, again, musings, theories, whatever you want to call those chunks of the book. Yes, there's too much. Melville's doing too much podcasting. Get to the meat and potatoes, But yeah, I think someone, though, who had a very good perspective on Moby Dick's status as a great novel was Bob Dylan. And he had this speech, when he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, where he talked about how this book, All Quiet on the Western Front, and The Odyssey were really impactful, especially Moby-Dick. And our producer Will's actually he's here. Bob Dylan's here. Oh, he's willing to. Oh, geez. Well, Bob. Hey,
Bob,
good to
how's
see you.
it going?
Bob, we only have 2 microphones. John, I'm maybe just going to give Bob my microphone, and then I'll just stand off the side. You want to just sort of talk? with Bob
That
for a
sounds
minute?
good. I mean,
okay.
I think he'll basically do most of the talking here.
Yeah, come on in, Bob. Yeah, good to meet you.
It's really wonderful. Really wonderful. How did you? Before we get into this, how did you think Timothée Chalamet did in A Complete Unknown?
I thought he did a great job capturing my essence. I'm a complete unknown, but I was very knowledgeable in that picture.
Wow. Well, that's great to hear. Very gracious of you. Well, why don't you tell us what you thought of Moby-Dick there, Bob?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to read from my Nobel Prize for Literature speech.
I don't mind at all.
Okay. I got the words right in front of me here. Talking about how Moby-Dick impacted me in my work. Everything is mixed in, all the myths. The Judeo-Christian Bible, Hindu myths, British legends, St. George, Perseus, Hercules, they're all whalers. Greek mythology, the gory business of cutting up a whale. Lots of facts in this book. Geographical knowledge, whale oil. Good for coronation of royalty. Noble families in the whaling industry. Whale oil is used to anoint the kings. History of the whale, phrenology, classic philosophy, pseudo-scientific theories, justification for discrimination, everything thrown in and none of it hardly rational. Highbrow, lowbrow, chasing illusion, chasing death. The great white whale, white as polar bear, white as a white man, the emperor, the nemesis, the embodiment of evil. The demented captain who actually lost his leg years ago trying to attack Moby with a knife. We see only the surface of things. We can interpret what lies below any way we see fit. Crewmen walk around on deck listening for mermaids, and sharks and vultures follow the ship. Reading skulls and faces like you read a book. Here's a face. I'll put it in front of you. Read it if you can. Okay, that's all the time I got. I got to head back. So
You got a hard out, Bob.
I got to go. I've only got a couple of minutes. Take care, Jim. It was good to see you. John, you too. Take care.
All right, thanks, Bob. Really appreciate you making
Thanks
time.
again, Bob, for Will'll walk you to your car. Wow, how about that? Huh?
Yeah, the great Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan, that was awesome, man.
Really
that was
cool.
great. Well, Bob, he just left, but if he were here, I would have loved to have told him to his face that in a very rambling fashion, this excerpt from his Nobel Prize for Literature speech kind of captures it. The book is this beautiful pastiche of all these different sources, and
It's a little bit of a mess, like the review is. Like
Yeah.
it's just hopping all over the place, stream of consciousness.
But I think if you were to make the case for it as the great American novel or this great book, these couple of paragraphs that our good buddy Bob Dylan was kind enough to read for us would
Yeah.
sort of capture it.
I think so. I mean, it really is just a titanic achievement.
Yeah.
And that I think really does bear some consideration.
Well, unfortunately, like you said, Bob had a heart out, so he won't be around for our last segment. But the rest of you, please come back after the break. We are going to pitch a modern-day film adaptation for Moby-Dick. Okay, here's the game. We are going to play act as studio executives, movie studio executives, and we have been given this very valuable public domain IP known as Moby-Dick. It's a very famous novel. Have you heard of it?
I have. We just
Good.
did a long podcast. I'm sorry. I'm a studio executive. Yes, vaguely. Yes.
Yes, great. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of kick ideas back and forth. You'll pitch an idea, I'll pitch an idea, and if we want, we can piggyback on each other's ideas and combine them, whatever we want to do. But you got the game?
I got the game.
Great. Go for it. Give me one of your Moby-Dick movie adaptation ideas.
So the very first thing, I think we should survey the field, like any good studio executive. So there's 2 primary adaptations. 1956, directed by John Huston. It's got Gregory Peck as Captain Ahab, a screenplay by Ray Bradbury.
Oh, wow.
You've got Orson Welles making an appearance in it, and I have seen it. It's quite good considering the acting and also the special effects of the time, very difficult in the 1950s. Now, we can improve upon this being in the modern era, but it does sort of fit the feel of it, that it would be this sort of ramshackle scene. And then there's also, of course, In the Heart of the Sea, which is directed by Ron Howard.
Is that the Chris Hemsworth one?
Yes, it's inspired by the sinking of a whaling ship.
Okay. Which the book was, inspired Moby-Dick.
But we don't want this. We don't want inspired. We want to make a modern retelling.
Right.
So my first rule off the top, No prequels. No prequels at all. We're not
Okay,
doing
okay.
an early, 20-year-old Captain Ahab. We're not doing Solo. Part of what's
Wow.
so great about Moby-Dick is that they're mysterious, these characters, and you meet them at the most interesting points in their life, I would say. So we're not doing prequels.
Well, I will say this. My idea for an opening scene was, the book starts at Call Me Ishmael, and Ishmael, thinking of putting one in his head and, popping around Nantucket. And that's not a very sexy way to open a movie. I think we kind of got to go James Bond, where we start with a big action set piece and then we cut to that. So I think what we do, and it's alluded to in the book, but it's not seen, so I'm not going to go too prequel heavy on you.
Yeah.
But I think the first scene, we do it in the middle of a rainstorm and a rollicking sea, and it's Captain Ahab and his old crew, and they're battling Moby-Dick, and, they're in the small boats, and whoosh, the white hump of the white whale goes past, and kablow, it blasts through the water and knocks his ship over, and we see Ahab's, leg, whatever, get wrapped up in the line of a harpoon, stabbed into Moby-Dick, and ripped off. Ahab cries to the heavens, "Arrgh!" Bang, smash cut to ding, 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 clop, 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 clop. Oh, all aboard. And Ishmael walking through the streets of Nantucket. So I think that's the way we open it. We open it with a big Ahab sort of set piece. And we don't see Ahab until probably, 20, 30 minutes into the movie anyway. So this way we kind of establish him up top and then let the audience know, don't worry, we'll get to Ahab later.
Yeah, you show a little Moby-Dick in the beginning. You give him a little flash, so for later,
You like that, though? You like that opening scene? Good.
I think that's. Let's put that down. Let's get our writers.
Good.
Writers to start on that. I think we can do this live action. I had been sort of hesitant.
Live action.
I think we can do this live.
I was
action.
thinking CGI heavy. CGI
heavy. Certainly. I think we hire those guys from Godzilla -1 that did Godzilla so well. We get them working on a whale.
Did they do some miniatures, or was it mostly CGI?
I think they did a little bit of both, and I think that'd be the way to go. You want a lived-in feel. You don't want the sleek sheen of pure CGI. I think you're going to want to mix and match.
Okay, you're winning me over on that. Here was one thing I was thinking, because the book is so long, and I'm thinking in terms of the format, we don't want to go mini-series. I know maybe some folks,
hot right now,
some folks would be tempted to because it's such a long book, but I think you got to slash and burn all Melville's bullcrap about whales being fish and the pseudoscience. You got to have it a lean hour 50, 2 hours at most film where pure plot, pure lean muscle, and we got to get rid of all the staring off and daydreaming and wondering what whales eat and stuff. We just want pure plot.
I think you're right there. I think you can get some, a few shots of the ocean, maybe an excerpt here or there.
But it's a swashbuckler.
Yeah,
it's an old school swashbuckler, and we got to keep the pace going.
Well, any great picture needs a dynamite cast.
Oh,
and so,
okay. You want to talk casting?
I'm talking casting.
All
I think
right,
Ahab, he's your main guy. That's going to put people in seats. It's the juiciest role. So I have a few options.
Okay, let me hear your Ahabs. I got a couple in my back pocket as well.
I would say the first one that I thought of, and I think this is the dramatic turn for him that maybe he's been waiting for really his whole life. I'm talking, of course, of Nick Offerman.
Wow.
I think would be a pretty great.
That's fabulous.
I think his eyes possess that sort of crazed look.
Beard.
He's got the beard. You can tell he's kind of lived hard. Or
he's
gives off an
magnetic.
appearance.
Yeah, that's fabulous.
Yeah.
Right body type, the beard. Oh, man.
But, Offerman, this isn't necessarily an A-list guy. Well thought of in the industry, I think it could be. So, of course, you're going to have to offer it to numero uno, hombre numero uno, obviously, Leonardo DiCaprio.
Oh, you need the A-list.
Total disappearance.
All right.
We're covering him with all sorts of prosthetics and junk. We're giving him the nice white scar across his face. He's walking with a peg leg for 3 months to get the walk down right.
Yeah.
He wants that second Oscar.
Oh, he's going for the second Oscar as Ahab.
Ahab. That's what I think. And here's my third one. I just think he's kind of got the physicality for it and the leader of menness about him. Tom Hardy. I think could really give a nice Ahab.
Get a stud in there.
Get a stud.
I like that.
Get a stud.
That's wonderful. I see. I thought of actors in their previous body of work. Willem Dafoe came to mind immediately because he's played essentially Ahab in The Lighthouse. He's already done the role, right? So he's got the chops. However, he maybe is a little old for the role, and he's kind of done it, right? Maybe he doesn't want to do it again.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, this Ahab fella, he's probably from Massachusetts.
Okay.
So you probably need some type of Massachusetts-based Boston-based actor to play him. And immediately what came to mind was Matt Damon.
Wow.
Or one of the Afflecks, right? Ben Affleck or Casey Affleck. I could kind of see all of them with the beard, with the scar. I could kind of see, it maybe isn't the typical role you would think of for them, but I think you maybe want a guy who you associate with, Boston, Nantucket, that sort of nor'easter, right? So those were the casting that came to mind. But I gotta say, man, your three, Offerman is a very curious one, but Hardy, man, Hardy is pretty awesome. So although, it's a great American novel, can you cast a British guy in such an American work? You wonder. Although it's a multicultural crew, isn't it?
That's right. I'd say of the three that you put forth, I like Damon. I think his sort of stubbiness.
Yes.
I think they're too lanky. I see Captain Ahab as being a very compact
Stout.
man.
Yeah, that's true.
Stout.
You need the body type.
Not stout is better. No offense to Matt Damon. He's not a stubby man. Okay, so here's my other thing. I'm thinking as a greedy, film executive. I'm always thinking about the bottom line.
Sure.
And of course, I'm thinking there's no chicks in this.
Oh,
there's no chicks
no
anywhere.
Love story. Yeah.
So I think
Good
we're gonna have
point.
to work in a mermaid plot line. I'm seeing Anya Taylor-Joy.
Yeah,
That's a
sure.
go picture.
That's a
you
go
got her
picture,
in the
yeah.
her in the
That's
tail,
yeah.
the clam bikini.
So hold on though. You just agreed with me. We got to trim the fat. This has got to be a lean swashbuckler, and you're adding in mermaid.
You got to get some chicks in this movie.
You got to get some romance.
Yeah.
Okay.
Either
I
that or
can
we're
see it.
leaning the other way completely. And we're
Gary,
going
Glenn Ross, all dudes, or what do you think?
or more of an I love you Philip Morris situation. We really lean into the homoeroticism.
Yeah, okay.
I'm also thinking, if I may, with a couple of other casting choices here,
my goodness,
I'm seeing a sort of a call me by your name with between Ishmael and Queequeg. I've got Austin Butler as Ishmael,
of course.
and Queequeg I think is Momoa.
Oh, good, yeah.
You want the
boy.
seasoned,
Those are
salty
a couple of
dog.
studs.
We're filling this out.
Man,
We're
this
filling
is a
cast
go
out.
picture.
Yeah.
One thing I think in terms of, I'll talk to the director and special effects department once they're locked in, but this picture, it's got to be excessively violent and grotesque.
Wow.
I think whaling is a very grotesque. I mean, this is almost like a movie you would want John Carpenter to make. You think of The Thing and the wonderful practical effects in that film. All the slicing into the blubber and the spermaceti and the ambergris and the harpooning and the blood and the sharks gnashing at the whale. I mean, you would really want some great practical effects. I know I said CGI for budgetary purposes, but you kind of convinced me on the Godzilla -1, the miniatures. I'm leaning practical effects. I get it. The budget's running up and up and up, but we're really getting a vision across here.
And here, if I may, to counteract the dude-heavy nature of this, ready for it? Female director, the woman who did The Substance, Coralie Fargier. I don't know.
Not sure how to pronounce her name, but sure. The practical effects were incredible.
Get the practical effects we
that's
would
true.
want for the blubber, for the ambergris, for
That's
the
true.
spermaceti.
Oh, I like that. I think another stylistic thing. I think you do that Evil Dead technique that Sam Raimi does, where you take the point of view of the evil spirit, right? And I think at certain times you got to take Moby-Dick's point of view when he's coming in at the ship and he's surfacing and destroying the boats. I think that's having Moby-Dick more of a character, I think would be a good way to play it.
I love that. I like little interludes of Moby-Dick sprinkled throughout, perhaps.
Chomping squids. Yeah. We cut out all the pontificating and the mealy mouth.
We got squid battles.
Yeah, we got squid battles.
In the deep sea.
I like that. Oh, a quick Ishmael pitch for casting.
Please.
Barry Keoghan. He's got that rough face, that you see on a sailor, and I feel like he's older than us, but he keeps playing quite young, and I think he can keep playing a young sailor.
I like that a lot.
You got anything else? My well's getting pretty well tapped. You got anything else?
Yeah, I would say these are all great ideas. If if we run into some issues or this gets backburnered, it may be one of those things where this might be best. I recently saw Lord of the Rings: War of the Rohirrim, where they have they tasked a Japanese anime studio to adapt a Lord of the Rings style tale. Did a fantastic job. It's really beautifully animated, and they had Brian Cox as the main voice of the king of the Rohirrim. I really think Brian Cox would be a fantastic voice of Ahab.
Oh, so you're talking about maybe doing an animated version of
I
this.
think
Oh
this
my,
might
oh
help
my.
us circumvent some of the difficulties of realizing
Yeah.
this in your live action.
Maybe
And
as less of a pop as a theater going experience, but perhaps we could get folks at home settling in to a nice animated picture.
That's
what you're
right.
thinking.
You could
Okay,
save
all
a
right.
few bucks with the voice cast to get
Sure.
Cox. That's your linchpin. That's what you're pinning.
Yeah,
everything
yeah.
on.
Hey, you tell everyone, hey, Cox is signed on.
We got Cox.
Yeah.
We got
Cox,
Cox for
yeah.
Dick.
yeah, yeah. We got Cox for Dick. Yeah. Well, on that note, I guess we can put a bow on this. I don't think you're going to be able to top that, are you?
I don't think so.
I don't think so. So we will just say, please subscribe, comment, and leave a rating. Send questions, comments, or big idea suggestions to our business email, flynnbrospod@gmail.com. Thank you to our producer, Will Slade, for booking Bob Dylan. That was quite a
Huge
treat.
get.
Yeah, we got to hang out with Bob Dylan, and we got a go picture. And we'll see you next time on the Flynn Brothers podcast. Buddy, take care.
You take care, buddy.